In the dead of night, on August 10th, 1945, two young American officers sat in a dimly lit room in Washington, D.C., scrambling to draw a line across a map of a country they barely understood. They used a National Geographic magazine as a reference. The country? Korea. The line. The 38th parallel. Their goal? To stop the Soviets from taking the whole peninsula after Japan's surrender. They had no idea they had just created the most dangerous border on Earth. But to understand how Korea was split in two, we have to go back, far back, before the Cold War, before World War II, before even the Japanese Empire. We must return to a time when Korea was one. For over 1,000 years, Korea was a unified kingdom, a land of scholars, warriors, and poets. Its culture was rich, its people resilient. Nestled between giants, China and Japan, Korea became known as the Hermit Kingdom, fiercely protective of its independence. But isolation wasn't enough to save it from the waves of imperial ambition. In 1910, Korea's fate changed forever. Japan annexed the peninsula, turning it into a colony. What followed was a brutal 35-year occupation. Korean culture was suppressed, its language banned from schools, thousands of artifacts stolen, its people forced to bow to the Emperor of Japan. Resistance was crushed, but it never died. Then came World War II. Japan's empire expanded across Asia, but it wouldn't last. When the tide turned against the Axis powers, the question emerged: what would happen to the lands Japan had taken? The Allies agreed that Korea would be free and independent in due course, but they couldn't agree on how. The United States and the Soviet Union, former allies in war, future enemies in ideology, both wanted influence in Asia, and Korea became the chessboard. Here's the twist: Korea didn't choose to split. It was divided by foreigners. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Korea was caught in a power vacuum. The Soviets advanced from the north. American forces approached from the south. To prevent a Soviet takeover of the entire peninsula, Washington rushed to draw a dividing line. Two U.S. colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were ordered to pick a place. They had just 30 minutes. They settled on the 38th parallel, not knowing if the Soviets would even agree. Surprisingly, they did. Soviet troops halted north of the line. U.S. forces landed in the south. What was meant to be temporary quickly became permanent. Both sides claimed they would unify Korea, but what unfolded was anything but cooperation. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla fighter trained in the Red Army. In the south, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, a Princeton-educated nationalist with a fierce anti-communist streak. Neither man had broad support. Both wanted to rule all of Korea, and both were willing to fight for it. By 1948, two Koreas had emerged. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, communist, authoritarian, and backed by the USSR. In the south, the Republic of Korea, capitalist, autocratic, and backed by the United States. The Cold War had carved a scar down Korea's spine. Then came the bloodshed. On June 25, 1950, North Korean tanks thundered across the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung believed the South would collapse quickly, but the United Nations, led by the US, intervened. Seoul fell, then was retaken. China entered the war. Cities were destroyed, mountains soaked in blood, and the peninsula burned with civil war. 3 years. over 3 million dead. And when the armistice was signed in 1953, the border barely moved. To this day, no peace treaty has been signed. The Korean War never officially ended. But here's what's often forgotten. The Korean people had no say. They were pawns in a global struggle between superpowers. Families were torn apart overnight. Villages found themselves split by an invisible line that hardened into barbed wire and watchtower. The demilitarized zone, 160 miles long, 2.5 miles wide, is now the most fortified border on Earth. It's a paradox, deadly and silent. On one side, loudspeakers blare propaganda. On the other, soldiers stare through binoculars, guns cocked, fingers poised. Yet across that line, the differences are staggering. South Korea rose from poverty to become one of the world's leading economies. It embraced democracy, endured dictatorships, and emerged as a tech giant and cultural powerhouse. North Korea, in contrast, became a closed-off totalitarian regime under the Kim dynasty. While South Koreans surf the internet, North Koreans worship statues. While Seoul blazes with neon lights, Pyongyang dims its lights to conserve power. And yet, they speak the same language, share the same history, trace their bloodlines to the same ancestors. For decades, there were whispers of reunification. Families separated for generations were allowed brief, tearful reunions. Children met parents they had never known. Brothers embraced after 50 years. But politics, fear, and mistrust keep the peninsula divided. The story of Korea's split isn't just one of geopolitics. It's a story of heartbreak, of strangers calling each other enemy, when just decades earlier, they were neighbors. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy of all. A country divided not by civil war, but by foreign pens. A people pulled apart not by hatred, but by the machinery of empire. When Dean Rusk later reflected on that moment in 1945, he admitted he didn't know much about Korea. He just hoped the line they drew wouldn't cause too much trouble. History, it seems, had other plans.